Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge all indigenous peoples of this land, but also who are part of our talk today. Welcome to our event here in COP28 here in Dubai. My name is Salah George Carter. I'm the Senior Research Fellow at the Australian National University, part of the Pacific Institute, but also part of the Institute of Climate Change, Energy and Disaster. We're very happy to be here today to lead a dialogue or convene a discussion around climate finance. At the Australian National University, we lead ourselves in our research as thought leaders, not only in terms of our research, but also in our convening abilities. COP is an essential point where, as a part of a mega platform, we'll be able to bring together not only leaders, policymakers, but also academic. Ladies and gentlemen, our presentation or our panel today, we will not be producing climate finance or pledging climate finance, as you've been hearing all around. Rather, as an academic institution, we'd like to take this opportunity to bring together, to dialogue, and think about the climate finance systems as of now, climate finance in terms of the negotiations, but also the future of climate finance, and the possibility of a COP31 climate finance agenda. So we made it a very open presentation in terms of our dialogue today, and we're very fortunate that we have with us an esteemed panel. Starting from the far left, we have with us Mr. Fred Patterson, who is the Regional Finance Readiness Advisor at the Secretariat Pacific Regional Environmental Program, who has countless years and decades in terms of experience of climate finance in the Solomon Islands, but also across regional organizations. We're fortunate that we also have with us Ngaluman Mana Ann Rasmussen, who is currently the lead negotiator for the AOSIS, Alliance of Small Island States, but as well as someone with a lot of experience of working in the Pacific in terms of her work as the Assistant CEO of the Climate Change Unit, which includes work with GEF and GCF over the years. And of course, we have Professor Howard Bamsey, who is at the RegNet, or the Regulation and Governance Unit at the Australian National University, someone who is not new, but I guess one of the people in terms of finance with experience and work with the Green Climate Fund, but also as a special envoy or ambassador of climate change for the Australian, for Department of Foreign Affairs in Australia. And of course, we have with us Kate Rogers, who is the Assistant Director at Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, with her focus on work around climate resilience and investment and finance branch. And so in terms of our panel, there are no speeches. We're just asking a question and then opening up to the panel, because we thought that this is an opportunity to hear also from you as part of this, and not only in your questions, but also that vision of what that climate finance is leading up to beyond just the current COP28, but also leading up to COP31. I thought we'll start, because we are here today in COP28, that I'll ask Ann Rasmussen if she can just give us a state of play in terms of climate finance negotiations and what she's seeing is happening here in Dubai.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I suppose with the noise, background noise, we'll have to scream extra hard, even if we have the mic. So I think challenges that we have at COPs is working with the noise. So, and I think that amplifies our voice as small island states in the negotiations. And thank you very much, Salah, for the introduction. It's always a pleasure to join us in the Pacific area. I mean, including Australia in this region. I think what you have asked yesterday, the opening of the COP, we witnessed a a historical decision on the operationalization and, of course, the capitalization of the loss and damage fund. The work is just begun. I think while we at the same time congratulate ourselves on that win, the work is just started. And I think we need to ensure the smooth and rapid operationalization of the fund, and of course, capitalization of the fund that responds to the calls by CIDS for fit for purpose and address the CIDS-specific needs. So I think that's where we are with the loss and damage fund. I know there's the GCF replenishment that's also happening around the climate finance space discussion here. And one of the other areas that EOSIS has been working really hard on is the new collective quantified goal, the NCQG. And we've called for COP28 to deliver a decision that sets us up for success for next year. I know there's a lot of issues and controversies around capturing progress made this year in the guidance provided by the high-level ministerial dialogue as well. But here at COP28, we will not live with just a procedure decision coming out of here. We want to ensure that the successful conclusion of this process at COP29 for the NCQG. I believe also that other finance architectures happening across the space. There's 20 finance agenda items that have been ongoing, and I think the work is just launched on those, and our negotiators for finance space for ASS is working very hard across those areas right now. So I think that's, there's more questions to come up, but that's a state of play of how we see the work on climate finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. And you mentioned in terms of that special consideration and what CIDS countries or Pacific countries are calling for. I'd like to ask on Fred, if you could reflect on some of these challenges in terms of climate financing, not only in the islands, but also your work around the regional organizations, and if you could update on that.
Thank you, George, and thank you, distinguished panelists. I think, like what Anne has mentioned, we will all realize that the Pacific, as part of the AOSIS group, has been calling for more investment in the region. And I think the Pacific context and also the issues around the geography of the region has made it difficult for maybe a lot of our global community to understand the region as well. The other thing about the Pacific is that the science that has been provided by the IPCC is quite clear. And so I think the needs of the region going forward has been an ongoing discussion in the region in terms of the kind of climate investment that is happening around, for example, the project-based approach in terms of climate change investments. There needs to be some concerted effort to take a long-term view. The Pacific is quite small, so the opportunity for transformative investment that could also achieve the SDGs, for example, is there. So given the size of the region, the countries are small. One of the things that we have been calling for is for a contextual approach to the needs of the region, a rapid mobilization of resources, some level of flexibility as well, and predictability in terms of access to finance, but also that investment to be scaled. We don't need a lot of scale because we are very small. So I think some of the investment that is happening in the region probably just need a bit of more thinking process to understand what are the real needs, provide the investment that is transformative in nature, build climate resilience, but also contribute to issues around the SDGs, the goals that the SDGs want to achieve. So I think the opportunity for the region, George, is really around climate investment could go beyond building resilience into achieving the SDGs as well. That is something I wanted to emphasize on this outset. Thank you, George.
Thank you very much, Fred. And so picking up on that question, on your point of the transformative nature going beyond climate resilience and investment, and this really leads into climate finance systems. And I'd like to turn to Kate. If you, as you observed in not only the discussions, but I mean the negotiations, but especially in the discussions you've seen and I mean you've been part of, what do you think needs to change in terms of climate finance systems?
Thank you very much for the question, and thanks for having me on the panel. Well, I mean, obviously, I think Fred's made some very good points. We need to increase mobilisation, and we need mobilisation to happen a whole lot faster. One of the things that I've observed and I've certainly had very direct feedback on when Australia was considering rejoining the GCF, we went out to our partner countries and we actually asked for their views on the GCF, and we got many examples of exactly how difficult it is for the Pacific to engage with the GCF. So I think as a region, we really need to keep the pressure up. It's easier for GCF to adapt than it is for us to change the systems in the Pacific. I mean, we've also talked about scale. We know that scale is an issue in the Pacific. It's an issue for private sector participation in climate projects and in infrastructure. The projects are simply too small to interest many private sector participants, and they and the populations are too small and too dispersed to be able to provide a revenue stream that makes many PPPs, public and private partnerships, viable. So I think there's real opportunity for being a bit creative, aggregating projects, looking to subsidise projects with public finance in order to make them attractive to the private sector. That's certainly something that we'll look at, and I've got a neat example of that in relation to a recent component of the Prime Minister announced at the recent PIF Leaders meeting, a $350 million investment in renewable energy in the region. One component of that is particularly interesting in terms of small scale and public finance being used to mobilise private. That is a mechanism that we already have called the Business Partnership Program, where we put up a certain amount of funding and say to the private sector, here it is, we'll match your funding, we want you to participate in this, but come up with something creative to achieve this outcome. And that has had really good results. They've had, for the round that's just closed, they've had 74 proposals to meet this objective of scaling up and rolling out renewable energy to the outer islands across the Pacific. So I think that goes to my broader point that we as climate finance providers and donors, we need to really, well, obviously we need to listen, and we are listening to the needs of the Pacific. What we need to also do is listen very carefully to the private sector when they tell us what the impediments are to them engaging. It's difficult for public servants to really get their heads around how the private sector thinks, but we really do need to attempt to do that and to listen. And then have the difficult conversations about using scarce development funding and climate finance to actually address those issues. So I think that's something that really does need to change, and it is sinking in. It's just perhaps not sinking in fast enough, and you know, there are challenges in for us in capability in this area. The other things that I just wanted to flag on this are the ecosystem. The ecosystem, we can't ignore it. We need to send really clear signals as to what we're trying to do, and our ambitions in terms of renewable adoption, mitigation, etc., and how we want to achieve that. And that can mean for countries like Australia, in terms of our own transition, we're addressing that through, you know, legislating our goal. We are moving into mandatory financial disclosures we're actually increasing transparency and improving financial system capability. That's important, and that will flow into the region, because if we can grow the sustainable finance sector in Australia and really inculcate that understanding of the benefits of sustainable finance, then we will have a pool that can be better deployed in the region. And I think that's something that's incumbent on all of us to do. And there'll be elements of that kind of broader ecosystem that can also need to sort of be adopted in the Pacific, and we can certainly help with that through our technical assistance programs, and we're very willing to do that. And I know there are some great examples of, I think, work in Fiji on things around carbon markets, those sorts of things. I guess the only other thing I would say is I do think, and I might just say this because 2 weeks ago I was out in remote Timor-Leste looking at some nature-based solutions projects. And the goal of those nature-based solutions projects was to eventually move into selling carbon credits. And I was very interested in looking at those to see whether there was potential for carbon credits to offer a modest but long-term and regular stream of income for some of these communities. And I do think there is potential for that to happen, but it will take time, and and the regulation and the standards are super important in this. So setting up the framework so that communities in the Pacific can access finance through doing what they do best, and that's protecting their environment, engaging in nature-based solutions for climate, I think is also an area that I'd like to see develop, and it will develop over the next few years. The challenge is it will develop over the next few years. We want to make sure it develops in a very good way. Stop there.
Thank you very much, Kate. I mean, you've touched upon sort of the next steps in terms of going beyond finance, in terms of in that creative. And I'd like to now turn to, which is really great, because I'd like to now ask about the innovation space and trends in climate finance. And, you know, in terms of the research, but also what you've been observing in terms of the big picture and where to next. I know that as a good academic policy maker, you have a PowerPoint to share with us. So,
Okay.
yeah, hand over to.
Thanks, George. I hope, my hope is that this conversation will be redundant, because by COP31 we will have fixed the climate finance problems. But sadly, I doubt it. I doubt it. I think it's worth having a look at the latest picture of the trends in climate finance as at the global level, to give us a sense of the context in which we're working, because, you know, as we've heard from everyone here, the focus of least of the people in this panel is what's happening in the Pacific region. So let's have a quick look at, I'm not sure how this goes, let's go. Yeah. This is all about how the Pacific's vulnerable. You wouldn't be in this room if you didn't already know this, so I'm going to skip over it. And, oh, well, not quite. I don't know what's happened to, well, the slides I was going to show you are missing somehow. But it's really reflecting a couple of points made in the latest Climate Policy Initiative survey of the landscape of global climate finance. CPI, I think, have the best view of this. They have the most comprehensive data sets and are able to present them very effectively. Disclosure, I would say that wouldn't I? I'm on their board, but it is quite striking in a number of respects. First, in the last couple of years, this is the way they analyse it, I won't go into the detail, but it's the last couple of years, the total amount of financial support for climate action around the world has radically increased, almost doubled. And that's real progress. The momentum is quite strong. Just as I was coming to this meeting, I ran into a friend who works for the Australian-based firm Pollination. He was heading off to another event separately where they are going to announce they're part of a new $1.5 billion adaptation fund that's done with the GCF and with MUFG from Japan and climate finance managers and others. But this is a really important step. It's the biggest adaptation fund I've heard of, and it's showing that the total finance picture around the world is changing. But when you look at where that finance is going, it's not so rosy a picture because most of it is where you'd expect. China, North America, and Europe. And when you look at if only I had the slide, when you look at the CPI picture of where the money's going around the world, what's called Other Oceania, which is the Pacific, South Pacific region, including Australia and New Zealand, is tiny compared with what's happening elsewhere. So things are improving. The Pacific is not showing high on the scoreline, and there's still an enormous gap in the amount of investment being made in climate action compared with what we need to get to the Paris objectives, the Paris Agreement objectives. So we've got problems. And I think by COP31, and this is getting to your specific question, George, we'll have a much better sense from the research that's going on at ANU and in other places of the new instruments we require in order for this, particularly the private finance, to flow. Because the Pacific provides, I think, some good examples of how business as usual, the old instruments, don't work any longer. One of the things I've learned about the multilateral development banks is that, like commercial banks, they like to do tomorrow what they did yesterday. They invest in expertise in how you do things, and after a while, they begin to think they've got the answers. You know, the people who build your houses are the same. Most of us are like that. We've learnt how to do something and we want to keep doing it. It's not going to work if we're going to deal with climate change. And finally, I think we're seeing the multilateral banks changing and adapting. And Kate made the point that the Green Climate Fund has to adapt in order to meet the needs of the Pacific. And I think what I keep in my mind is we need Pacific specifics. We really have to focus on the particular circumstances of the region if we're going to resolve the problems. That means not doing the sorts of things that we've learnt to do, but thinking through new ways of dealing with the issues. And lack of scale is one problem. One of my slides had a description of from an IMF working paper of the very complex financial arrangements that arise in the Pacific as a result of the lack of scale and the number of entities involved. So the complexity is also very high, which is counterintuitive and even worse. So this means we've got to think through the specific problems of the Pacific and come up with instruments that really meet the needs. I said I had an example of instruments that don't. Renewables in the Pacific are a really important vehicle, not just for mitigation, in fact, less for mitigation than for resilience. Because if you think about the impact of extreme events that are becoming more frequent, first thing you lose is your water system, and the second thing you lose is your power system. Introduction of renewables to replace diesel will improve the robustness of power systems and thus the resilience of the system itself when these increasingly frequent events occur, and it will improve the financial resilience of the economies of the countries concerned because they won't have to import diesel. So one of the things we've done, and I won't name the institutions, but you know which ones they are, one of the things we've done with the best intentions is subsidise the expansion of renewables in the Pacific, when in fact you have a terrific business case in many cases, given local tariffs, for not requiring subsidies. But what you do require, to go to your point, Kate, is to listen to what private investors need if they're going to make their investments. And what they need is instruments that deal with the risks they see as preventing or as obstacles to their investment. Won't go into it at the moment, but we know now enough about what those risks are to know that the usual instruments of subsidies, for example, are pointless and are not going to work, and that what we want really, in most cases, are some form of offtake guarantees for renewables. So I think we're starting to find our way to some answers for our region, and that's part of starting to find our way to answers globally. It's not going to be the same in China or North America, and there the obstacles have been, in many cases, resolved because there the business cases are more obvious and the scale is so much greater, so investment flows more easily. We've got our own set of problems to resolve. We need all the resources in the region and beyond, but I'm very confident if we aggregate our efforts as well as our projects, we can find some answers before COP31.
Thank you very much, Howard, for those insights. I think not only the potential in terms of the work that needs to be carried out, but the potential of research in terms of exploring those instruments. I'd like to give the opportunity to the floor to engage with the speakers, but also engage in, as I've said, we've pointed this side event as a time for us to sit and ponder. While there's so much pledging going around and also in the state of negotiations, we also need to think forward in terms of the vision and where climate finance needs to go for the Pacific, but the potential of having the COP at this part of the world where we can lead in terms of some of these examples that Howard was talking about in this space of climate finance and coming towards here. So I hand over the floor for any interventions or questions. Yes, Letitia, we'll probably have two and then come back to the team.
So who's that? Thank you very much for those interventions. And I think when I imagine a COP held in the Pacific, what comes immediately to mind related to finance is how we can sustain the provision in the Convention about special circumstances of CITES. As you know, it's been under attack for some time, and it has repercussions for access to finance and how the different funds are operating. So I just would like to ask the different panelists how they feel that this principle can be preserved, can be protected, and even more to be enacted going towards the COP in the Pacific. And as you said, how to make sure that there are specific modalities, specific instruments, very tailored to CITES circumstances.
Thank you so much, and thanks for a really interesting discussion so far. I think there's a bit of a synergy actually between my intervention and the question that was just asked. I'm working in the CIDS unit in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the UN, and one of the big things that we're focused on at the moment is the CIDS conference that's happening next year in May. That's a once every 10-year opportunity for CIDS to really highlight their priorities, and I think at that moment the political attention really is on CIDS. So I think this question around making the case for CIDS vulnerability, that's something that's kind of front and centre of mind for our office, and of course as we work with AOSIS to prepare for the conference. And we've conducted a range of regional consultations in each of the CIDS regions and an interregional consultation, and access to climate finance and scaling up climate finance is something that came through obviously so strongly. And the operationalisation and capitalisation of the Loss and Damage Fund with special allocations for CIDS, but also something that we've heard a lot is really about the access requirements and the application requirements for some of the global environment funds, including the GCF, and how they can be complex and arduous for CIDS, and really thinking through how we can use that conference as an opportunity to kind of push for some of those reforms. So I guess just putting that on the table as another opportunity that's coming up ahead of COP31. I'm just really interested to hear from the panel maybe their thoughts on how we can use next year's conference, noting that that's kind of got a 10-year view, but kind of using that as a stepping stone from this COP, and then of course to the COP31 that will hopefully be in the Pacific.
I'll kick off by admitting how old I am almost. So when I first started working on the Pacific back in 1995 as a young economist, this issue around how completely unfair the allocation system of the international finance institutions was for small island developing states was very, very much in mind at not talking about climate finance, but just generally in development, because we all know that GNI per capita is biased towards it's biased against small populations. It makes sense if you think of the population of Niue. If everyone invited their extended family back for the weekend they did census, their GNI per capita will look very different than if they didn't. And obviously the fixed costs of operating a government are very, very high, and that really works against the CIDS. And frankly, I've been beating my head against this brick wall ever since 1995 in interactions with MDBs, the IMF, other donors from the North. It's a challenge, and if it's a challenge for me, I can only imagine the frustration it causes to my Pacific friends, because it's really challenging. So the issue about trying to measure vulnerability and putting that alongside GNI per capita as a means of demonstrating the challenges faced, it's been around for a long time. In fact, I believe it's been worked on for about 30 years, and the MVI, I think, was just recently endorsed. I have some concerns around that. I think breaking down vulnerability. I heard a very smart person said to me, when you think about a person's vulnerability, you don't break it down into vulnerabilities for what. So I think this issue of how we really demonstrate the additional needs and the vulnerability of Pacific Island countries is very important in the climate finance space. I'm not sure the MVI will be necessarily the right solution to that, but my Pacific colleagues have no doubt got views on that. In terms of the processes and how we sort of streamline them, I think the really important thing here is, as I said at the beginning, the onus should be on the finance providers to adapt, not the Pacific Island countries. And I was on a session about capacity building earlier this week, and as someone who's worked on public financial management in the region on and off since that date, it's very hard. It's very hard to meet donor requirements just generally, and I just believe that we need to work together to keep the pressure on the climate finance providers. Over to you.
Thank you. I think I wanted to just respond to the questions from the floor with regards to the questions around the special circumstances of SIDS and LDCs. Just this week in the negotiations within the GGA framework, this discussion has come up, and it's a concern to the Alliance of Small Island States. First of all, that special circumstances of SIDS is already written in Paris Agreement, and we are not here to renegotiate the Paris Agreement. That's already part of what we have in Article for Access to Finance, Article 9.4 with regards to special circumstances. So I think the question Letitia has asked from the floor in terms of the special circumstances that are under attack at this COP, and it waters down the fundamental provision of the convention to allow SIDS and LDCs to have access to climate finance, support capacity building, and that. So I think one of the major concerns, and as highlighted, this COP31 could firmly establish this principle and enforce preferential treatment in access to climate finance if Australia continues to advocate for that. And we also, there's a question in terms of not only do we have a milestone loss and damage fund, but by the COP31 it should be fully operationalized, staffed, but it also should be already be dispersing funds to the vulnerable, you know, from here on out. As you rightfully say, for GCF, it takes 5 to 6 years for a country to receive funding. And by that time, your national priorities have changed. Sea level rise would already double, and storm surges and Category 5 cyclones will continue to bombard the small island states, which sets us back with development. So I think with the evolution of these new climate finance, it needs to be fit for purpose, and it needs to address the needs of SIDS and LDCs. Whether we have factors like MVI, GNI, and all of that, indicators and so forth, that's still up for discussions in various forums and various areas. But in terms of noting that finance should flow to SIDS and LDCs, that's already a given, already under the Paris Agreement, already under the Convention, already within the Agenda 21 and way before the UNFCCC. So I think it's enshrined in law, and we need, if COP31 is to eventuate, we need it, and it's in the Pacific, and we would feel much safer if Australia and partners who are going to host the COP will re-establish and reaffirm that this is already an issue, and we need, because it's under attack here at COP. So we are fighting hard as small island states to maintain that language, because we are asked to remove it from here. So I think that's what I wanted to come in on, to just reflect on some of the questions, but also accessibility is an issue because of the many various aspects that we face and the projects at the level that we have. Accessing these finances is very hard in terms of the multilateral funds, in terms of the MDBs and reforms. As you are aware, we're calling for the reforms of the MDBs. I don't know when that will happen or how that will eventuate. And of course, the World Bank, which we know under the TC is the interim for the loss and damage fund. But it's one of the most older institutions that we don't know how to get into that engine and reform, but hopefully they're listening to the cause of the countries, and they need to have a fit for purpose window that every small islands can access the funds. So I think that's something that I would like to leave with the panel. We can talk about all sorts of principles, all sorts of mechanisms to access these funds. we can talk about MVIs, GNIs, and all sorts of different mechanisms that allow SIDS to. There's no question on the vulnerability of SIDS, and we shouldn't take that away from accessing the funds. I think I wanted to add that, Salah, and thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I quickly, picking up from where Anne left, the leaders of the Pacific have declared that we are in a state of emergency. So this underscores the importance of rapid deployment of climate finance in the region. And I think Anne have mentioned, I think the issue of national circumstance, probably we could discuss that within the context of climate science. Yeah? The Pacific is highly vulnerable. The IPCC reports, multiple science reports or the publications have alluded to that. The solutions to climate change in the Pacific is in the Pacific. And I think that's the second point I wanted to emphasize. We have regional agencies that have positioned themselves to support the region. I work for SPREP. We have SPC, we have the PIVs as well, and other regional agencies that are, and the mechanisms are there. We should capitalize on those mechanisms. And my colleague here also talked about capacity building. We have the Pacific Climate Change Center based in SPREP, which is deploying capacity building and investment in support to Pacific Island countries as well. So the mechanism is there. In terms of country priorities, George, I just want to reflect on it as well. The NAPs and the NDCs are already reflecting on the priorities of Pacific Island countries. So as a climate finance advisor in the region, I am a bit, sometimes I find it difficult to understand when we keep asking, what are your priorities? Our priorities are in the NDCs and the NAPs. And so we should be thinking strategically on how we can address those priorities and deploy resources to address those. Just on final point on the private sector, I wanted to say that the private sector in the region is quite small, almost insignificant, except for the larger countries in the region like PNG and Fiji, for example. But one of the things we have experienced in the region is that every time there is a climate-induced disaster, the private sector is the first people that sometimes government tend to. Please contribute, please help support. That kind of request goes to the private sector. So I think I agree with Kate that the private sector should be part of the solution. But the investment in the private sector should be it's almost like it is not wrong to invest grants in the private sector if it's for climate change. So that kind of thinking, the way we think about it, the way we approach it has to change. And I think the issue of predictable finance is a priority for Pacific at this COP. I think the GCF, for example, has been complex. The Pacific is calling for country-based allocations, regional presence in the region, just to address some of the issues that we've been facing over the last couple of years. So I will stop here, George, and these are my reflections on the Pacific experience as well. I think the regional agencies have been doing all they can, and sometimes we just need to be assertive and say, these are the priorities, please, we need to invest in this. And because our leaders have declared we are in a state of emergency. Thank you.
Maybe just a couple of small points, George, to conclude with. Kate talked about and I've mentioned earlier the inertia that there is in the international financial institutional system, that it's not responsive to the needs of SIDS and other small countries. It's really directed by its donor base and the big developing countries. And that's, I think, the dynamic at this COP that you're talking about, Anne, where that vast group of, for want of a better word, power, influence, has a sense of where it wants to go. and the CIDS needs are different, and they need different responses. I think, as I said earlier, we're beginning to see real change in some of the MDBs now, and I mean, the World Bank has changed its mission title with a few more words. That sounds like nothing, but it could really be something. I think the ADB now describes itself as the Climate Change Bank. Again, just words, but they signify, they symbolise an intent. But if I can be excused for coming to the GCF, I think in the GCF, it's a new institution. It has a mandate to change the development paradigm, to make sure that it operates in a way which gives those who benefit from its finance the capacity to decide their own climate futures and not to simply accept what international figures tell them is good for them. Now, there have been a whole lot of problems, and some have been mentioned in the way the GCF's been operating, and I think the way they've described their own situation in their report to the COP this year is they're maturing, and I think that is the case. But if this inertia in institutions is going to be overcome, it is going to require some champions in those institutions to champion the needs, the specific needs of CIDS and in the case of the discussion we're having of Pacific Island countries. And I think Australia has been a champion for the Pacific Island countries, in particular in the GCF. The Foreign Minister has announced that Australia will be renewing contributions to the GCF. I hope that those contributions will see Australia return to the board of the GCF so that that position of champion for the region can be restored. I think that could be a vehicle for bringing this new institution less inertia bound than the bigger, older ones, bringing it to, as Kate said earlier, to adapt to the needs of the countries it's serving rather than to have them adapt to its requirements. And I think there's a possibility there that we shouldn't ignore.
Thank you very much, Howard. And on that note, I'd like to thank the panelists. I know that there's another event that's coming up. But as I've said, the purpose of this, all around this whole week, we've been hearing pledging in terms of climate finance. The university heralds itself in terms of ability to bring not only our research, but brokering that research in terms of bringing together leaders, bringing together negotiators, bringing together regional organizations and civil society, but also aid funders, development funders, and partners, as well as academia. We just use this hour just to sit here and just reflect on what's going on, and just also remind us of these debates in terms of how multifaceted climate finance is. And I hope this is of use to you. For us, it has given us the instructions of where research can come through. In terms of the innovation of finance, the need to do more in terms of the private sector, and how we also make sure that part of that research is disseminated, but also part and is engaged, is of use to this process as well. And I guess in the way that we leave this discussion is to be continued. And we look forward to more of your, if you want to connect with us, there's the QR code. We at the Australian National University, both at the Pacific Institute, but we also have the Institute of Climate Change, Energy and Disaster, but as well as the different researchers around the room. We have researchers from the university. We also have with us our students from the Pacific and First Nations here in the room, and we look forward to engaging with you as the next session comes through, because there's a lot more to share, and a lot in terms of the research, but also what we're teaching at the university, our degrees, and hopefully ways to we can engage in our research and our teaching for possible COP31 in the Pacific. So thank you very much to our wonderful speakers and also our audience, and all the best. Whaftai te le lau.